They took my money, my space, and my voice, all in the name of family. One summer night, a single sentence at a crowded pier made me realize I'd vanished from my own life. That was the night I decided to take everything back and leave without looking back. The gulls circled lazily above Willow Harbor that afternoon, their cries weaving in and out of the sound of music drifting from the pier. The summer block party was in full swing, picnic tables lined with lobster rolls and coleslaw, paper lanterns bobbing gently in the breeze, children darting between the stalls with faces painted like tigers and butterflies. From where I stood near the drinks table, I could smell the mingled perfume of salt, air, butter, and grilling fish. Lindsay's business, Pierce Coastal Catering, was at the heart of it all. She and Chris had set up 2 long buffet tables under a white canopy, the kind they used for wedding receptions. Trays of seafood shimmered on ice. Servers in matching aprons moved briskly between guests, and Lindsay's voice carried above the crowd as she gave instructions, her hands slicing the air with quick, sharp gestures. I was speaking to Mrs. Whitmore, one of the teachers from the school, about the library fundraiser we were planning for autumn. She was worried about the turnout. Times were tight for many families in town. If we could make the food more affordable, maybe people would stay longer, she said. I nodded, half thinking aloud. You know, Lindsay could include a couple of simpler menu items, maybe clam chowder in cups, or some sandwiches for those who can't manage the lobster prices. I didn't even see Lindsay approach. One moment she was across the lawn. The next, she was at my side. Her face taut, eyes flicking to the teacher, and back to me. Her voice was crisp enough to slice through the laughter nearby. Mom, please stop interrupting. This is our business, not yours. It wasn't shouted, but it might as well have been. The air seemed to contract. A couple at the drinks table stopped pouring lemonade. Somewhere behind me, someone coughed, the sound oddly loud in the hush. Chris, who was replenishing the drinks from a cooler, glanced up. He gave me a small, quick smile that tried to apologize for her tone, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he bent back over the cooler, fishing for another bottle of sparkling water. I could feel the heat rise in my face, but I kept my smile fixed, as though the remark hadn't bruised me in front of half the harbor. I murmured something to Mrs. Whitmore, I don't even remember what, and excused myself from the table. My stomach was tight, my hands oddly cold despite the warmth of the afternoon. From the pier, a burst of music spilled over the chatter. But for me, the edges of the day had blurred. All I could see was the image of my antique reading chair upstairs in my room, the only piece of my old apartment I'd kept when I moved in with them. Walnut arms smoothed by decades of hands, the cushion faded to a warm gold. My place, I'd told myself, when I brought it here. But more and more, it felt like an afterthought, pushed into a corner of someone else's home. I stayed for the rest of the event, because leaving would have been noticed, and noticed meant questioned. I smiled at familiar faces, tasted a bite of the blueberry pie someone pressed on me, even helped a child who'd dropped his ice cream. All the while, Lindsay's words sat like a stone in my chest. When it was over and the tables were being cleared, I walked home alone, the sound of laughter still floating from the pier. Upstairs, I sank into my chair. The smell of grilled fish clung to my blouse, mingling with the faint scent of lavender sachet I kept in the side pocket. From downstairs, the muffled strains of music and voices floated up. Chris's low rumble, Lindsay's bright laugh. It was as though nothing had happened. For them, maybe it was nothing. A small correction, a moment's irritation. But for me, it was the kind of moment that stays under the skin, that lingers, sharp and stinging, like salt pressed into a cut. I sat there, hands resting on the worn arms of my chair, and told myself to remember exactly how this felt. 8 months ago, the winter had been unusually cruel in Willow Harbor. The wind off the bay cut through even the thickest wool coat, and the steps of the town library, my second home for over 2 decades, were slick with an invisible skin of ice. I was carrying a box of donated paperbacks that day, thinking about where they might fit on the shelves. One moment I was upright, the next I was staring at a pale sky, the box upended, books scattered like startled birds. Pain shot through my hip, clean and merciless. I remember the ceiling lights in the ambulance swaying above me, the metallic tang of oxygen, the distant chatter of the paramedics, then the long, sterile quiet of the hospital room white walls, the faint beep of a monitor, the dry heat that made my lips crack. Lindsay arrived first. She swept into the room in her navy coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. Holding a bouquet of winter lilies, she leaned down, kissed my forehead, and murmured, "You scared me half to death." Her eyes were red, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years, and I believed her in that moment. Chris followed, balancing a stack of glossy catering brochures in one arm and a takeaway coffee in the other. He placed the brochures on the side table with an awkward chuckle, saying, "Figured I'd give you something nice to look at." For 2 days, we spoke about everything but the future. Then, on the third day, Lindsay sat at the edge of my bed, hands clasped in her lap. "Mom, you can't stay alone anymore. No bills, no stairs. You'll be safe with us." She made it sound so simple, like a gift I would be foolish to refuse. I was still bruised from the fall, not just my body but my confidence. Safety sounded like a warm blanket. I didn't have the strength to pull over myself. By the end of that week, I'd agreed. I told myself it was temporary, just until I felt steady on my feet again. I sold nearly everything: the old oak desk, my dining table, the mismatched but beloved chairs from the kitchen. My apartment lease went to a young couple just starting out. I rented a small storage unit for the things I couldn't part with: a few boxes of books, my grandmother's teacups, and the antique reading chair Thomas and I had picked out from a little shop in Boston on our first anniversary. The first months in their house felt almost like a promise kept. I folded laundry on Sundays, the scent of fabric softener rising in little clouds. I picked up Clara, 10, and Oliver, 13, from school, listening to them chatter about spelling tests and soccer games. I helped with homework at the kitchen island, my coffee cooling beside me as I coaxed Oliver through algebra problems. I paid for groceries without fuss, slipped Chris the money for the van's brake repair, quietly covered the cost of Clara's summer art camp. When Lindsay said the business was tight this season, then came the bigger ask. Chris mentioned over breakfast that they'd found a house closer to the pier, with room for a proper catering kitchen. The bank would approve the mortgage, but the down payment was stretching them. Before I could think, I heard myself say, "How much?" The answer, $150,000, sounded enormous, but I wrote the bank draft anyway. Chris called it a loan. Lindsay smiled and called it a family investment. We never signed a single paper. It was after they moved that the small shifts began. My books, which I'd stacked neatly on the living room shelves, were moved to a box in the hall to keep the decor consistent. The reading chair I'd fought to bring with me was once shoved into the garage to make space for extra catering equipment before a wedding order. When I asked about it, Lindsay said lightly, "It's just for the weekend, Mom. You don't mind, do you?" I said I didn't, but I minded. God help me. I minded more than I let on. And every time I walked past that chair in the garage, draped with a plastic drop cloth and smelling faintly of gasoline, something inside me shifted a little further from them and a little closer to the door. The morning began quietly, the way I like it, though not for the reasons I'd have chosen. The house was still, a thin gray light spilling in through the blinds. I made my way to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and took my favorite teacup from the cupboard, one of the few pieces I'd kept from my old life. As the water boiled, I opened the small wooden box I keep on the counter. Inside, tied with a faded ribbon, were the letters Thomas had written me over the years. Birthdays, anniversaries, ordinary Tuesdays. I chose one from our 10th anniversary, his handwriting steady and bold, and read it as the kettle began to hum. "You are the steady harbor in every storm," he'd written. My throat tightened. I poured the tea, letting the steam fog my glasses for a moment, almost grateful for the blur. By the time Lindsay came down, laptop under her arm, I had scrambled eggs on the stove. She moved briskly, sliding into her chair at the kitchen island and opening the laptop in one smooth motion. I tried to sound casual, as if the thought had just occurred to me. I saw a bakery special on chocolate cake this morning, I said, stirring the eggs. The one with the ganache. She murmured without looking up, fingers flying over the keyboard. The sound of typing filled the space between us. She took a sip of coffee, already back in whatever world lived inside that screen. By midday, the house had emptied Lindsay out for meetings, Chris making deliveries, the children at school. I sat in my room, the sunlight catching on the spines of my books, and waited for the day to feel like my birthday. It never did. No card slid under the door. No cheerful, "Happy birthday, Grandma," when the phone rang. The only call came from Patricia "Pat" Mulligan, my old librarian friend. She remembered without needing Facebook to remind her. We spoke for nearly half an hour, about books and weather and her knee surgery next month. She asked if I was doing anything special tonight. I lied and said we'd probably have dinner together. Dinner was, in fact, together in the way that people can share a table, without sharing much else. The kids chattered between themselves, until Clara turned to me. "Grandma, did you really have a dog once? What was his name?" Her eyes were bright, curious. I smiled. "Yes, a little terrier named Boots. We've talked about this." Lindsay cut in sharply, not looking up from spooning mashed potatoes onto her plate. "Allergies, remember?" Chris said nothing. He reached for the pepper, ground it over his plate, and avoided my gaze. Clara's shoulders dropped, and Oliver went back to pushing corn around his dish. I chewed slowly, tasting nothing. The warmth from the potatoes cooled quickly in my mouth. When the meal was over, I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it quietly, and placed it in the dishwasher. The sound of the door clicking shut felt final, like punctuation at the end of a chapter I hadn't wanted to write. Upstairs, the house's hum softened voices downstairs muffled by distance, the faint rattle of wind against the window. I sat at my desk and opened my ledger notebook. The pages were blank, the paper smooth beneath my hand. I wrote the first list I'd made in months. Asterisk. Call bank. Contact attorney. Asterisk. Check investments. Asterisk. Retrieve storage keys. Asterisk. Find a place to go. The last line I wrote slowly, my pen hesitating halfway through, as if the words themselves were heavier than the ink. I closed the notebook gently, slid it into the drawer, and sat for a long while with my hands in my lap, listening to the faint echo of laughter drifting up from downstairs. It did not sound like my laughter, and I wondered if they would even notice that. The April sun was soft that afternoon, warm enough to make the soil smell alive again. Clara and I were in the back garden, sitting cross-legged on the grass, with her science log spread between us. She was sketching the daffodils that had just started to open, her pencil scratching lightly on the page. I handed her the ruler to mark the stem's height. Without looking up, she said, almost as an afterthought, "Mom says you'll have your own place by summer." Me. The words landed in me like a stone dropped into deep water, no splash. Just the quiet heaviness pulling down. I smiled, though it felt brittle. "Did she?" I said lightly, adjusting one of the petals she'd drawn. Clara nodded, still bent over her page, her hair falling across her cheek. I told her she was doing a fine job, that her drawing would get a gold star for neatness. But my hands were colder now. Later that evening, I was carrying a basket of folded laundry past the half-closed door to the kitchen when I heard my name. I stopped, without meaning to. "She's helpful, but always here," Lindsay was saying. Her voice was low, but tight, the way she sounded when speaking to a vendor who'd made a mistake. Chris replied, "She helped buy the house. Exactly why we need boundaries," Lindsay said. There was a pause, then the sound of cutlery being set down harder than it needed to be. "We can't run a business and have her underfoot all the time." I stood there a moment longer, my fingers pressing into the folded shirts until they wrinkled again. The smell of roasted vegetables drifted out into the hallway, but it didn't make me hungry. I turned away before they could see me. That night, I sat at my desk, under the dim circle of my reading lamp. The ledger notebook lay open to the list I'd made on my birthday. The ink had faded just slightly at the edges where I'd rested my hand too many times. I took my pen and began crossing things off. Call lawyer to revoke power of attorney. Call bank To remove joint account access. Check investments. 3 neat lines through the first 3 items. It should have felt like progress, like armor sliding into place. Instead, I stared at the last 2. Retrieve storage keys. Find a place to go. My hand hovered above the page, pen tip grazing the paper without leaving a mark. I could almost hear Clara's laugh as she'd held up the daffodil sketch to the sunlight. I pictured Oliver, his gangly frame in that too big baseball jersey, grinning when he got on base. The thought of missing Clara's school play in June made my chest ache. I'd promised Oliver I'd be there for his first game of the season. Was I being selfish? I leaned back in the chair, the lamplight throwing long shadows across the room. From downstairs came the faint sound of the dishwasher, the occasional clink of plates settling. A normal evening, if you ignored the words still echoing in my head. She's helpful, but always here. I told myself I'd wait until after summer. See the play, watch the games, keep the peace a little longer. But the list stayed open on my desk, the ink dark against the cream paper, as if it were waiting for me to stop pretending I didn't already know what had to come next. When I closed the ledger, the sound was soft, but it felt like a door being pushed halfway shut. Not locked yet, but not wide open either. Patricia called one morning while I was peeling apples for a pie I'd promised Clara. Her voice had that warm, conspiratorial tone I'd known since our library days. Joyce, have you heard about Harborview Residences? Not a nursing home, don't you dare think that. Independent living. There's a cafe, a library nook, even a small courtyard. You'd like it. I told her I was only curious. Just to look. That's what I said aloud. Inside, I think I already knew curiosity was only half the truth. 2 days later, I was standing in the lobby of Harborview. The air was different there. Light, open, with the smell of fresh coffee from the cafe drifting through the hall. The floors gleamed, but didn't feel sterile. Through the wide glass windows, I could see the courtyard where an oak tree stood, broad and rooted, its branches catching the late morning sun. The tour was polite, unhurried. There was a small library nook with deep chairs and shelves lined with well-thumbed novels. The cafe had a chalkboard menu listing clam, chowder, sandwiches, and scones. But it was the corner unit they showed me last. That's when something loosened in my chest. The room had a sliding glass door that opened directly to the courtyard oak. The breeze carried in salt from the harbor, and that faint, comforting bitterness of roasted coffee. I could see it immediately. My antique reading chair angled toward the glass, sunlight spilling over the armrest. My ledger notebook on a small side table, pen ready. The quiet would be mine. The view mine. The space mine. I didn't say much. I nodded, asked a few questions about rent and meals. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I told the manager I wanted to reserve it for the following week. She smiled, made a note, and handed me a card with my new address written neatly on the back. I tucked it into my purse, my fingers lingering there a moment longer than needed. Driving home, I felt oddly steady, as if I'd found a path in the dark and marked it in my mind. That steadiness cracked when I noticed the manila envelope on the passenger seat of Chris's truck. I'd borrowed it because Lindsay's car was in the driveway blocking mine. The envelope was thick, stamped with the logo of a local real estate office. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe I already suspected. Inside were the closing documents for the house we lived in now. The same house my $150,000 had helped them buy. Every cent of that money was listed in the down payment. There was no mention of a loan, no repayment terms, no note acknowledging it was mine. Just absorbed into the foundation, the walls, the roof, all without a single conversation. By the time I got upstairs to my room, the air in my lungs felt heavy, like I'd swallowed stones. I sat in my chair, my real one, the one that had survived the garage and Lindsay's just for the weekend, and opened the ledger notebook. My pen moved before I'd fully formed the thought. The loan becomes a scholarship fund for Willow Harbor's library programs in mine and Thomas's name. The words looked final on the page, clean and sharp. For years, Thomas and I had believed in giving back to the place that had given us so much: the harbor, the library, the people who had filled our lives with more than money ever could. Now, it was settled. They had their house. I would have my oak tree, my view, my name, our name, on something that couldn't be erased, tucked into someone else's walls. The sky was still pale when I set the suitcase by the front door. The house smelled faintly of last night's dinner, garlic and rosemary, already turning stale in the still air. I had booked the cab for 6:30, early enough that the streets would still be quiet, late enough that I could walk out without the whole house watching. I was shrugging into my coat when I heard her steps on the stairs. Lindsay appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her hair loose and tangled from sleep. She took in the suitcase, the coat, my hand on the handle. "Is this about the party?" she asked, her voice scratchy but sharp. "It's about everything," I said. The words came out even, though my heart was thudding. She moved closer, arms folding across her chest as if she could block the door. "We can talk after work. I have a meeting this morning." "I've already arranged things," I said, cutting her off. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Her lips parted, then pressed tight. When she spoke again, her voice cracked in a way I hadn't expected. "You're just leaving?" There were tears in her eyes, part anger, part something that looked like fear. I wanted to tell her I'd thought about this for months, that this wasn't a whim or punishment, but the words would sound like excuses, and I had no more of those left in me. Upstairs, the children were still asleep. Clara's soft breathing, Oliver's restless turning. I could picture both, without opening their doors. I didn't wake them. A goodbye whispered in the dark would only be for me, and they deserved better than that. Chris appeared at the top of the stairs, his hand on the banister. He watched, but didn't come down. His eyes flicked between us, unreadable, and I wondered if he was thinking about the envelope I'd found in his truck, or about the things we'd never said out loud. The cab's headlights cut across the living room curtains. I bent to lift my suitcase. Lindsay stepped aside, not looking at me as I passed. The air between us felt heavier than the bag in my hand. The driver loaded my case into the trunk, and as we pulled away, I opened the window. The sea air rushed in cold, briny, sharp enough to make me breathe deeper than I had in months. The pier slid past, gulls wheeling overhead, their cries rising above the low hum of the engine. At Harbor View, the lobby smelled of coffee and polish. The oak tree in the courtyard stood where I'd left it, its branches stirring in the morning breeze. I carried my bag into the new space, shutting the door behind me with a quiet click. Unpacking was slow, deliberate. The reading chair went by the window, angled toward the glass so the morning light would spill across the armrest. My books found their places on the shelves, spines lined in familiar rows. The teacups went into the cupboard, each one unchipped and in its proper place. I made tea, the first cup in my own kitchen in 8 months, and carried it to the chair. Outside, the oak's leaves shifted, dappling the light. I opened the ledger notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "What I can do now: choose my own meals, open the windows when I want, leave a book on the table without it being moved." The list was short, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough. It was 2 weeks before I saw her again. The knock on my door at Harbor View was sharp, impatient. When I opened it, Lindsay stood there, hair pulled back, eyes already flashing. "You froze the account?" she said, stepping in without waiting. "And the money?" I closed the door behind her slowly. "I didn't need permission," I said, "to take back what's mine." Her arms folded tight. "Do you have any idea what this has done to us? The business is struggling. I'm under pressure from every side: staff, suppliers, the bank." Her voice wavered just enough to make me look closer. She wasn't lying about the pressure. I could see it in the slump of her shoulders, the faint shadows under her eyes. For a moment, something shifted in me, the old reflex to soothe, to offer a solution. But I didn't. The sympathy came and went, like a tide. "I'm sorry for the struggle," I said, But that money was never yours to lose. Ah, her lips pressed together, and she gave a short, almost bitter laugh. I guess you've really moved on. I've moved out, I corrected. There's a difference. She left soon after, not slamming the door but closing it with a firmness that spoke louder than a bang. A month later, the cream envelope arrived in my mailbox, the handwriting unmistakable. Pierce Coastal Catering's 10th anniversary and housewarming in looping script, with a gold embossed flourish, no personal note. Just the event details. I went. Not to reconcile that word didn't fit anymore, but because I'd paid for part of that house, and I wasn't about to erase myself from its walls. The driveway was lined with cars when I arrived. The house glowed with strings of white lights, the hum of conversation spilling out onto the porch. Inside, the air smelled of rosemary focaccia and seafood chowder. I moved through the crowd, nodding to neighbors, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing server. Clara spotted me first. She ran across the room and wrapped her arms around my waist, holding on longer than I expected. Oliver followed, taller now, and leaned close enough to murmur, "It's weird without you." I smiled and told him, "I miss them too," but the words caught in my throat. Lindsay found me just before the toast. She was radiant in a deep blue dress, the kind that photographs well. "Glad you could make it," she said, the smile polished, not warm. Chris stood beside her, lifting his glass. 10 years in business," he began, "and a beautiful new home to share with friends." Lindsay took over. "Tonight is about family and gratitude, about the people who've helped us build what we have." Her gaze swept the room, but didn't linger on me. She never said my name, but I noticed the glances quick, sideways from a few guests who knew exactly where that $150,000 had come from. The applause rose around me. I lifted my glass, took a measured sip, and set it down. The slideshow was about to begin, and I didn't need to see my absence flicker across the screen between smiling photos of them. I walked out into the cool night air, my head high, the sound of clinking glasses fading behind me. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I reached my car. By the time I turned onto the main road, the house was just a warm blur in the rearview mirror, smaller now, somehow, than the oak tree waiting for me, back at Harborview. Harborview's cafe was strung with paper lanterns, the color of ripe pears, their soft light casting warm pools across the tables. The smell of cinnamon and brewed coffee hung in the air. "Storytelling night," the flyer had said. Residents, staff, and guests were invited to share something from their lives. A memory, a lesson, a moment that changed them. I'd planned to sit quietly at the back, sip tea, and listen. But Patricia had other plans. She nudged me with her elbow, her eyes glinting. "You've got a story, Joyce. One worth telling." "I'm not," I started, but she was already lifting her hand to signal the organizer. Before I could protest, my name was called. The microphone was lighter than I expected. I stood there for a moment, letting the murmurs settle, the oak tree visible through the glass behind the audience, its branches moving in the night breeze. "I want to tell you about kindness," I began, my voice steady, "and what happens when it has no boundaries." I didn't name names, didn't talk about $150,000 or reading chairs in garages. Instead, I spoke about the way small concessions chip away at a person. How, please, just for now, becomes, "This is how it is." I told them about the morning teas gone cold, the birthdays passed over, the conversations overheard through thin walls. "Kindness without boundaries," I said, "is just slow erasure. One day you look in the mirror, and you've been rubbed out, almost entirely, except for the part someone else finds useful." When I finished, the applause was warm, not polite. It filled the space and wrapped around me in a way that made my throat ache. A week later, Clara and Oliver came to visit. They bounded through the lobby carrying something flat and wrapped in brown paper. Clara thrust it into my hands. "Open it, Grandma." Inside was a drawing in colored pencil, my oak tree, branches sprawling across the page, the sliding glass door drawn in careful lines. Above it, in Clara's blocky handwriting, "Grandma's new home." It's not perfect, Oliver said, half smiling. But we thought you'd like it. I love it, I said, and meant it more than they could know. We took a blanket outside and sat under the real oak tree, the one in the courtyard. Clara unpacked a tote bag of library books, some new. Some I recognized from years ago. Oliver read the first pages of a mystery in his slow, deliberate way. Clara took the next chapter, her voice lilting with the characters' moods. The sun shifted, the air cooling as evening came on. But they didn't ask when I was coming back. That question wasn't hanging between us anymore. When they left, I made tea and sat by the window, the framed drawing propped on the side table beside my ledger notebook. I opened it to a clean page and wrote, I stayed quiet so long I forgot I had a voice. Now I have a view, a chair, and my name. That's enough. Outside, the oak's branches swayed gently, like they were agreeing. I've learned that kindness without boundaries can slowly erase who you are. For years, I thought giving more meant loving more, until I realized I was giving myself away piece by piece. Protecting your dignity isn't selfish. It's how you honor the life you've built. At any age, you have the right to space, respect, and choices that are truly your own. The moment you reclaim your voice, you reclaim your freedom. If you believe in stories that remind us of self-worth and resilience, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more grandma revenge stories.